Welcome to Discovering. We're going to take a little break from fishing, that's what we've had on the show for the last couple of weeks, and take a walk through the woods instead. We'll take a tour of the Slate River Forest Reserve in Baraga County and learn about some of the Nature Conservancy's management plans for the forest.
And the reality of the Upper Peninsula for the last 150 years is a lot of these forests have been managed pretty poorly. You're standing in an exception right now.
So sit back and relax. It's Monday night and it's time for Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
"84% of the UP is forested land. Half of these forests, about 4.5 million acres, are public land, state and federal. The remaining half is owned by a mixture of private individuals, timber corporations, local governments, and conservation groups. The Nature Conservancy is one of these groups. TNC recently purchased just over 10,000 acres in Baraga County, known as the Slate River Forest Reserve. I toured the property with a couple of TNC project managers to talk about the forest, their plans, and what makes it special.
I'm Alex Hellman. I'm the forest project manager for TNC in Michigan. My role is primarily managing our forest reserves that we own. So we own about 50,000 acres across the UP that are in these working forest reserves. So they're different from our preserves in that they're larger properties. Most of them are enrolled in the Commercial Forest Act, which mandates us to do sustainable but commercial forest management. The main reason we own these lands partially is protection, right? Especially places like this with the high gradient streams like the Slate and Ravine River, we saw it as a protection opportunity. But then also the management focus, so ensuring that these properties are still going to be providing wood fiber for the local economy. I mean, forestry is one of the biggest components of our economy in the UP, and also culturally very important. And so those are kind of the main reasons. And then I want to give you a little history about this property specifically. So this, going back as far as physical ownership of the property, it was owned originally by the Ford Motor Company. They used to own a lot of land in this part of the Upper Peninsula. They had sawmills in Alberta and in Pequaming. And then in the 60s, the Jacobson family purchased a lot of the Ford ownership in northern Baraga County, and their focus was growing high quality hardwood saw timber. So at that time, a lot of the forest landscape was going towards pulpwood production. So smaller diameter, faster growing trees, but there are still good markets for, the wood that gets turned into flooring, cabinetry, other products that use hardwood lumber. So the Jacobson family managed this property with a long-term focus of growing large, high-quality northern hardwood saw timber. So that's sugar maple, red maple, yellow birch, some oak, but primarily sugar maple being the cash crop. So we're standing in a red pine forest, which I can talk a little bit about, but most of the property is dominated by sugar maple and eastern hemlock. And then there's a whole smattering of other species that are part of those forests.
The Nature Conservancy was invited to bid on the land and purchased it in 2021.
We've owned it for closing in on 3 years, but we're still very new owners here in the grand scheme of things. This spot is unique. This is a natural red pine forest. There's not very many of those left, unfortunately. Mostly along Lake Superior or the other Great Lakes. We have some natural red pine forests, some in the outwash plains like the Baraga Plains. There's some natural pine forests, but a lot of the red pine we see is in plantations, right? We see the straight rows, really clean understory, and that's an important part of our economy. Obviously, we need that source of wood fiber, but for TNC, these kinds of natural pine stands are extremely important. This was likely originated from a fire. These bigger mature trees are probably 100 to 150 years old. I haven't aged any of them yet. I've been meaning to do that, but they're old for this landscape, at least, where a lot of this was cut over not too long ago. Red pine is fire dependent and relies on relatively frequent surface fires to burn up the duff, to expose the bare mineral soil where red pine seeds can germinate. And their bark it's relatively fire resistant. Historically, with fire suppression, a lot of them have transitioned to maple stands or other, we call it mesification. Mesic is just another word for saying kind of moist. Fancy scientific term for moister sites. So these sites have turned into maple or like spruce fir dominated sites. In a natural red pine stand, it wouldn't be just red pine. You would have white pine in the overstory, some maybe red maple, a little bit of spruce and fir, and oak, but which is pretty well represented in this stand. This is only 15 acres, this particular red pine stand. We'll drive through the property and we'll see a lot of other forest types, but this is the only red pine stand that we have that's like this across the 50,000 acres that I manage. So we want to do some fire in here. Like I said, this duff layer is really dense. You have to dig down pretty far to get to sand. So there's some. So in addition to all the needles, we have a lot of just like organic matter that's relatively decomposed, but it's still not the bare mineral soil that red pine needs to germinate in. So in order to get down to that and kill off some of this invading maple, we would have to do successive fires. Before burning, we would open the canopy up a little bit. Red pine is a relatively shade intolerant species, so they need lots of light to grow. So we would remove some of the mature individuals in here. Definitely not all of them, but open it up a little bit and then do fire probably a few years in a row to burn back some of this organic material, and then hopefully get native red pine regeneration, or at the very least provide a better seed bed. The other challenge here is we're in a deer yard. So this part of northern Baraga County into Marquette County is high deer. There's super high deer numbers here in the winter. Particularly, you'll notice when we get into the Hemlock stands, it's like a park underneath. It's very, very clean, and that's because deer love hanging out there in the winter. But that also means it's challenging to regenerate some certain species that deer like to eat in the winter. Pretty much anything that's green. So they'll eat white pine, they'll eat red pine, they love hemlock and cedar. And so that's a challenge to regenerating conifers here, is that there's so many deer here in the winter, and they chow down on all that. So it's a balance. Obviously, deer are, an important species, not only ecologically, but culturally. So, we have to figure out a way to work with the deer and maybe do fencing or other ways to discourage deer in this specific spot if we want to have good conifer regeneration.
While we were there, we hiked down to the Slate River to check out the river and some small waterfalls before heading to the next spot on our tour. Portions of the forest are open to the public for hiking, bird watching, photography, fishing, and hunting. No motorized vehicles or non-motorized vehicles are permitted, along with no camping and no pets.
So yeah, this part of the property is open to the public. Parts of it are leased, so there are private leases, but this part of the property has always been open to the public even before TNC purchased it. And we opened up more of the Slate River corridor to public use, especially on this side of the river. You have to go up river a decent ways to get to the first lease boundary.
At our second stop on the tour, the project managers talked about TNC's plans for northern hardwood forest management, not only managing the forest for timber production, but also for carbon sequestration, the process of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide with the goal of helping to reduce global climate change.
So right now, we're in a time of mass global change where we have effectively pulled carbon from the ground in the form of fossil fuels and other things, and moved that carbon into the atmosphere. And so what I do in a forest is look at a forest and say, all right, well, how much can we do to manage this forest better in order to store more carbon both in the biomass and below ground? And there's ways to manage a forest using Alex's knowledge as a silviculturalist and a forester to be able to maximize the amount of carbon that we're storing in trees, and then also figuring out the delicate balance between storage of carbon in woody material and then the rate at which that carbon comes out of the atmosphere. So young trees here, like this little guy, or this slightly larger tree, young trees, like if you can imagine an infant, they grow really fast. So they're doing a good deal of removing of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but they're not storing a ton of carbon because they're not all that big. So if you think about the years 0 through 15 of a human life, you're looking at mass amount of growth. So you're pulling carbon into a tree pretty quickly. When you start to get to this older tree, it starts to grow a lot slower. So you're not removing all that much carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into woody material, but you're storing a ton of it. So these are the two sort of balances of carbon in a forest ecosystem. Essentially, we can use management strategies, which either are looking at longer intervals between harvests, or figuring out better ways to remove trees from a forest to be turned into wood products that can maximize carbon benefit, but also maximize other co-benefits like water quality, carbon mitigation, obviously, but also climate adaptation. So having more species and more age classes of trees, which Alex will talk about in a minute here, is super beneficial to long-term continuation of a forest ecosystem, but also it's great for the balance between that storage and that sequestration of carbon.
With northern hardwood silviculture, and especially focusing on growing older forests, growing forests with larger diameter, higher quality saw timber like these trees, you're really focusing on minimal disturbance, so small canopy openings to make sure there's enough light to regenerate the next cohort of trees. Maintaining an uneven age structure. So when we manage or manipulate the forest, we're not just taking all the large, high quality trees or all the small pole-sized trees. We're removing trees through all those different ages. And what that gives us is a lot of shade or mid-shade tolerant species that are able to grow up into those canopy or group gaps. But then we'll also have areas where we're standing now, there's some seedlings here and there, but we're mostly under a predominantly closed canopy where we've got a lot of mature trees. And the end result of that on good soils like we have here, we get really nice sugar maple and other hardwoods, but particularly, like I said earlier, sugar maple is the cash crop. So they're growing up really tall and straight because there's a lot of shade. So they're trying to race to the canopy. They're not branching out immediately like they would in an open space. So you don't see a lot of really low forks. You don't see a lot of twisted trees. You see a lot of, straight trees that have a lot of saw timber material in them. These are high quality products. So we can grow really big trees here, and we can still harvest some of those. We always leave legacy trees that we'll never harvest, that will get big and old and then die, and those will be good for wildlife habitat, and a whole host of, everything from insects to mammals and birds. Those are important components of a older forest. It's a cool way to be able to kind of try to do both in protecting these ecosystems, sequestering carbon, but also still deriving an economic benefit. So we are in a hemlock-dominated northern hardwood forest. The main difference being that there's just more hemlock here, and it's a little older, I would say. Hemlock kind of is a sign of a older northern hardwood forest, the climax forest. Obviously, forests aren't static, so, even old growth forests, there would be disturbance that would reset succession back to fast-growing early species. Again, this is an old growth. You can see stumps. This has been managed for a long time, but it has old growth characteristics, especially a lot of these larger hemlock, which are really cool. It's a slow-growing tree. It's one of the most shade-tolerant trees in the world. So it can hang out under a dense canopy in an understory in almost full shade, biding its time for some sunlight to race up to the canopy. It is long-lived. Some of these trees are, I'm sure, at least 100, 150, 200 years old. There are probably some individuals older than that. The wood itself is really rot-resistant and really hard. It was used a lot for culverts, or bridges. They would use hemlock. It's really high in tannins, so they being like the lumber barons of yesteryear would harvest hemlock bark and send it to the tanneries in Chicago, Milwaukee, to be used in the tanning process. Now we have synthetic chemicals that do that. Nowadays, from an economic perspective, of course, hemlock has some really important ecological characteristics. It's kind of the main reason why this property is unique. Hemlock is really important for lots of songbirds, tropical migrants. It has a really, I like to use the word decadent canopy, where there's all these layering, many branches. As you look up, you can see why it casts so much shade. It's super dense, the small needles that are all layered. It also is really highly associated with a couple of our weasel species like fisher and martin. They really like forests with lots of hemlock. I think primarily they use it as cover for hunting, so they can kind of hunt and get around unnoticed and a little more stealthily than in open hardwood forests. Because it's so rot resistant, it lasts on the standing dead and on the forest floor for a really long time, which again is important for all those species that use dead wood. On the forest floor, it's a really important nurse log. Dead wood is just as important as living wood. So it hasn't carried a lumber grade for a long time, and that means it's relegated to pulp. Or what has happened on a lot of industry land historically is it was removed in place of growing the more valuable trees like maple, yellow birch, oak in some cases. So when we look at, especially if you look at Slate River from a satellite image, you can see so much hemlock here, and then if you look at the surrounding landscape, there's a lot less. So that's a really unique part of this property that we want to maintain. It's important for deer yards as well. It's warmer in here during the winter. There's less snow. There's food, which is the challenge, because the deer eat the young hemlock. So the challenge is trying to maintain hemlock on the landscape. And also, obviously, we see a lot of big trees. It's storing a lot of carbon. So a lot of our carbon storage on this property is in hemlock, because it's really large, it's long-lived, and there's just a lot of it on this property.
In June, after I filmed this tour, the Nature Conservancy transferred 760 acres of this property to the Keweenaw Indian community, the land which is within KBIC's 1842 reservation boundaries. Thank you to Alex and John for the tour, showing us these beautiful forests and learning more about forest management. That's all for tonight, and I hope to see you right back here next week for Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.